For anyone who has not watched the recent live stream done by Sargon and Kristi Winters, well, it was quite the spectacle, to say the least. It seems they set out to discuss the results of the midterm elections in the United States regarding Sargon's assertion that the left is dying, but the stream ended up lost in the rose bushes for most of the duration, and for anyone who likes to watch YouTube debates, this is not exactly astonishing. The stream can pretty much be divided into 3 phases. The first consisted of the participants at least trying to address the original debate topic, which mostly involved Kristi and her Kiwi comic relief pulling out statistics and demanding that Sargon answer for them, which he apparently did not prepare for at all, even though he was the one who wanted to do the debate. Shortly after this, we enter the second phase, which began when Sargon insisted upon knowing his opponent's definition of the term far right, which they refused to give. This kicked off an episode of autistic screeching, which culminated in Sargon muting himself in rage while Kristi and her sidekick laughed at him and congratulated themselves for winning this little spur-off. Sargon eventually came back and they got into a discussion of gender roles, which was by far the least obnoxious part of the whole affair. In the aftermath of this stream, a slew of videos have been produced, mostly by critics of liberalistism joining in on the Sargon bashing. And yes, if you ask me, both sides of this are pretty annoying. But in this video, I don't want to make fun of Sargon or talk about the arguments that actually managed to be made. Anyone can go watch the stream and decide on that for themselves, and in any case, I don't find them very interesting. In fact, that is kind of the point. This little exchange perfectly illustrates a principle that I and many of those watching may find troubling. To explain my irritation, I'd like to begin by citing the now infamous Francis Fukuyama and his book The End of History and the Last Man. For anyone unfamiliar with this work, the basic thesis is that the Hegelian dialectic of history finds its ultimate destination in liberal democracy rather than communism, as was popularly held at the time of publication. This in itself is not exceedingly innovative, but Fukuyama goes on to assert that history as a phenomenon will cease to matter when a global liberal polity is established. He claims that liberalism is the most ethically correct system humanity has or will ever produce, and therefore declares that a worldwide liberal hegemony is an ideal to be striven for, hence the titular End of History. This attitude, whether conscious or otherwise, has been adopted by the policy-making elites of the world, although most overtly in the neo-imperialistic function of the United States as the enforcer of the liberal world order. I could dedicate an entire video to the faults of liberalism. It is certainly not the irreproachable ideal Fukuyama submits it to be, and I most likely will do this in the future. However, that is not my objective at this particular point. I would like to take this line of thought in another direction, because when we consider that the universal triumph of a single political system will have effects beyond its immediate prescriptions, we discover a worrisome truth. Historically, politics was a contest of values. The contention between competing factions was derived from the very deepest levels of principle. To use philosophical terms, the battle was fought on the grounds of the a priori rather than the posteriori. But this all ended with the final destruction of communism, the last complete theory standing in opposition to liberalism, following the fall of the Soviet Union. Liberalism then gained a kind of social monopoly over acceptability, first within its own states, but to be sure concertedly pushing outward. So-called respectable political discourse in the West is therefore limited to what falls within the narrow scope of liberal premises. This is known as the end of politics, as analogous to Fukuyama's end of history. And this, more than anything, is what needles me about the debate between Sargon and Kristi, and more broadly, modern politics in general. At the most elemental level, Sargon and Kristi do not disagree about anything. They share the same philosophical premises, and all they are really doing is arguing over whose ideas best exemplify those premises. This may seem unlikely, but as a thought experiment, let's consider a set of statements and decide whether Kristi or Sargon would take exception to any one. Number 1. All people are of equal worth. Number 2. Inherent differences between people may exist, but these should not be discriminated against by law. Number 3. Ideally, an individual is the best determiner of their own destiny. Number 4. Government should be accountable to the will of the populace. Number 5. Restrictions upon liberty are, with a few exceptions, morally wrong. In reality, the ideological subsets personified by Sargon and Kristi diverge on a much higher branch of the political family tree than some may suspect, and this is, in a nutshell, what makes modern politics so irksome. At this point, most people in the political mainstream are not even aware of the division between premises and manifestations, and treat their, all things considered, minor disagreements as earth-shattering. There is only so much of this overhyped, petty argumentation that one can take before it becomes tiresome. So when Richard Spencer says that the current mainstream is boring and uninnovative, in a way he is right. And don't get me wrong, there is a place for this type of dialogue. I am just sick of seeing it utterly dominate the mainstream. As much as people may like to think of someone like Ben Shapiro or Steven Crowder as an edgy firebrand, the things they say are actually extremely mild, and the presence of a few dozen rabid Antifa hooligans does not change that. So what do we do about this? Well, just because one political theory is overly dominant does not mean that there are no dissidents among its subjects. It just means that they are denied mainstream legitimacy and confined to the intellectual backstreets. Given this, as a solution to our predicament, I think our best chances are somewhere along the lines of an idea proposed by Alain de Benoit, that being an alliance of the fringe against the center. I have said this before, and this means that those of us who find ourselves outside the boundaries of acceptable thought, Marxists, identitarians, traditionalists, should, as a matter of pragmatism, set aside our radical differences in order to work towards the shared goal of the overthrow of liberal hegemony. Of course, this is an extremely vague proposition, and I am not sure what sort of practical form such an alliance would take, but the fact is that alone, none of these dissident movements have the stamina or clout to accomplish much in the long term. And although our differences may be insurmountable in some cases, as they well should be, this matters very little in such a context. If we remain divided, we will never even gain the opportunity to see our ideals realized. Our movements and our ideas will sadly fizzle and die with the last of our active practitioners.